The hum of the ocean is the only thing keeping me grounded right now. I'm standing in the bridal suite of the Azure Pavilion, looking at myself in the mirror. The silk of my dress feels like a second skin, hand-stitched and costing more than my parents' mortgage. But to them, I'm still the unfortunate daughter, the one who couldn't quite keep up with her sister's Ivy League trajectory. Today is my wedding day. My parents, Elias and Martha, arrived an hour ago. I watched from the balcony as they stepped off the transport ferry, purposely dressed in faded, pilled sweaters and scuffed shoes. The kind of clothes you'd wear to paint a garage. It was a calculated insult, a visual protest against what they called my irresponsible budget bin lifestyle. They think I've dragged them to a public park on a remote, low-rent outcrop to marry a man they've deemed a financial dead end. I wonder, as you're listening to this, maybe while doing chores or driving home, have you ever felt completely invisible to the people who are supposed to love you most? Have you ever stood in a room, screaming with your success, only for them to look right through you and see a failure? My mother walked into the suite without knocking, her nose wrinkled as if she smelled something sour. She smoothed her moth-eaten cardigan and looked at my dress with a pitying smile. "It's a lovely effort, dear," she whispered, her voice dripping with that quiet, lethal condensation. "Very DIY. We didn't want to overdress and make your little party look even smaller by comparison. Your father and I decided to match the aesthetic of your surroundings." She thinks we're on a rented patch of sand with a generic pavilion. She doesn't realize that the Azure Pavilion isn't a public venue. She doesn't know that the transport ferry is a private shuttle I commission for guests. Most importantly, she has no idea that the budget bin lifestyle she mocks is actually a multi-million-dollar empire built while she was busy praising my sister's mid-level corporate promotions. I just smiled at her. A calm, steady smile. "I appreciate you coming, Mom. I want you to be exactly who you are today. It's important that everyone sees the real you." She patted my cheek, missing the ice in my eyes. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. They think they're here to witness my mediocrity. They have no clue they're standing on my soil." The walk down the aisle was silent, save for the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs. My father, Elias, marched beside me with a grimace, his hand resting heavily on my arm. He was wearing an old windbreaker with a broken zipper, a stark, jagged contrast to the bespoke tuxedo my fiancé, Julian, wore at the altar. To any outsider, it looked like a father begrudgingly giving away a daughter who had failed him. To me, it was the final confirmation of his character. As we reached the front, he didn't whisper a word of pride. He simply leaned in and muttered, "I hope you didn't bankrupt yourself for this extravagance, Elara. It's a lot of theater for a girl with no script." I didn't flinch. I just looked at Julian, the man who actually knows my balance sheets, the man who helped me build the very infrastructure we were standing on. We exchanged vows under a canopy of white orchids that my mother had already whispered were clearly silk knockoffs. She sat in the front row, huddled in her pilled sweater, looking around the terrace with a performative air of pity. During the cocktail hour, the mask of concerned parents began to slip into something more jagged. My sister, Clara, the golden child, was there too, dressed in a sensible drab wool dress to stand in solidarity with my parents' protest of my supposed financial recklessness. "It's okay, Elara," Clara said, swirling a glass of sparkling cider she assumed was cheap grocery store brand. "We know you're trying to overcompensate. We won't tell the extended family how much debt you probably took on for this island rental." "I appreciate the discretion, Clara," I replied, my voice as steady as the horizon. Then came the toast. My father stood up, clinking a fork against his glass. He didn't talk about my childhood or my happiness. Instead, he pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "We know things have been hard for you, Elara," he announced to the 60 guests, his voice booming with a false, patronizing warmth. "And we didn't want your marriage to start on the back foot. So, Martha and I, despite our own limited means today, have decided to give you a head start." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a check for $500 and a printed list of budgeting for beginners seminars in our hometown. The guests, most of whom were high-level investors and partners who knew exactly who I was, went stone-cold silent. My father mistook their shock for awe at his generosity. He didn't notice the sleek black folder resting on the table next to my bouquet. He didn't see the deed of ownership tucked inside, or the manifest for the private jet waiting at the airstrip on the north side of the island. He just smiled, triumphant in his rags, waiting for me to thank him for his sacrifice. The silence in the room was heavy, but not for the reasons my father imagined. He stood there, chest puffed out in his windbreaker, basking in what he thought was a moment of moral superiority. My mother nodded solemnly, her eyes scanning the guests as if inviting them to join in her pity for her struggling daughter. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper but carrying through the silent hall. "It's exactly what I expected." My sister, Clara, leaned over and patted my hand. "Don't be embarrassed, Elara. We all have to start somewhere, even if you're starting a bit later than the rest of us." She glanced at the centerpieces, orchids that cost more than her car, and sighed. "It's a shame you spent so much on the flowers when you clearly need the cash." I felt Julian's hand on the small of my back, a steadying presence. He knew the hidden factor I was holding. He knew that for the last 5 years, while my parents were busy funneling my sister's success stories into the family group chat, I had been acquiring the very land they were standing on. I reached for the black leather folder sitting next to my bouquet. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I stood up slowly. "You know," I began, looking at my mother's frayed sweater, "I've spent a lot of time wondering why you chose today to dress like this, to act like this. I realized it's because you need me to be small so that you can feel big. You need me to be the cheap wedding so you can be the generous saviors." My father's face reddened. "Now, Elara, don't be ungrateful. We came all this way to this public park." "This isn't a public park, Dad," I interrupted softly. "And that ferry you took? It wasn't a city shuttle. It's a private transport for the staff of the estate." I opened the folder. Inside wasn't just a deed. It was a series of transition documents. "I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you about my career in the city," I continued. "The one you told everyone was freelance clerical work. It turns out, when you own the firm, the clerical work is mostly signing checks, like the one I just signed to finalize the purchase of this entire island chain." I slid a single sheet of paper across the linen tablecloth toward my father. It wasn't a budgeting for beginners brochure. It was a formal eviction notice for the commercial warehouse my father had been renting for his struggling hardware business, a warehouse that had recently been bought by a holding company. My holding company. My mother's hand went to her throat. "What is this? This is a joke." "It's not a joke, Mom," I said, my tone as calm as the sea. "It's a business decision, and unfortunately, the new owner doesn't think you're a high-value tenant." The color drained from my father's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray that clashed horribly with his windbreaker. He snatched the paper, his hands trembling as his eyes darted over the corporate seal at the top. The logo, a stylized SRL, matched the one on the napkins, the wine glasses, and the discreet gold pins worn by the waitstaff he'd spent the last hour ignoring. You bought the industrial park?" he stammered, his voice losing its booming authority. "But that was an anonymous investment group. They told us the rent was being restructured." "Restructured is a polite word for evaluated," I said, taking a slow sip of the vintage champagne my sister had called sparkling juice. And when I looked at the books, I saw a tenant who was 6 months behind, coasting on the goodwill of a previous owner who didn't want to see an old man fail. But as you always told me, Dad, business isn't about feelings, it's about results. My mother stood up, her pilled sweater snagging on the back of her chair. "Elara, this is cruel. We are your parents. We came here in these clothes to show you that wealth doesn't matter, that we support you even in your poverty." "No, Mom," I said, finally letting a hint of iron enter my voice. "You came here in these clothes to embarrass me. You wanted the photos of my wedding to look like a charity case so you could tell your friends how brave you were for attending. You wanted to be the martyrs of my failure." I turned to Clara, who was staring at the deed on the table as if it were a venomous snake. "And Clara, that promotion you've been bragging about at the firm, the one you said was finally putting the family name on the map." I slid a second document toward her. It was a corporate organizational chart. At the very top, in the slot for the parent company's CEO, was my name. "I didn't just buy the island, Clara. I bought the firm 3 months ago. Your boss reports to my board, and according to your last quarterly review, your stellar performance was mostly taking credit for your assistant's work. My board doesn't like dead weight." The silence in the room was absolute now. The rags they wore suddenly didn't look like a noble protest anymore. They looked like exactly what they were. A pathetic attempt to diminish someone who had already outgrown them. "You can't do this," my father whispered, the bravado finally shattered. "We're family." "Family wears their best to a wedding, Dad," I replied. "Family celebrates when one of their own succeeds. You're just tenants, and the lease is up." The frantic apologies started almost instantly. My mother reached across the table, her hand trembling, trying to grab my arm with a sudden, desperate affection that felt colder than the ocean spray. "Elara, darling, we didn't want you to feel pressured by our success. We wanted to stay humble for you." "Humble isn't a costume you put on to mock your daughter's life," I said, stepping back out of her reach. "And success isn't something you withhold to keep someone under your thumb." I looked around the room. My guests, the partners, the mentors, the friends who had actually invested in my dreams when my own blood wouldn't, stood like a silent jury. My father looked down at his scuffed shoes, finally realizing that the rags he wore were the only thing he had left. He wasn't a patriarch anymore. He was a man who had insulted the woman who held his livelihood in her hands. "The ferry leaves in 30 minutes, I said, my voice calm and final. "It will take you back to the mainland. My assistants have already packed your bags from the guest wing. Since you wanted a cheap experience so badly, I've arranged for a taxi to meet you at the docks. No private cars this time." Clara looked like she was about to burst into tears, her golden child status evaporating in the salt air. "Elara, please. My job." "Your job will be handled by HR, Clara, just like any other employee. I won't interfere, but I won't protect you either. Let's see how that Ivy League trajectory holds up on its own merit." As they shuffled out of the pavilion, hunched, small, and looking exactly like the paupers they had pretended to be, a strange peace settled over me. It wasn't the fiery, loud vengeance of a movie. It was the silent revenge. The quiet realization that I no longer needed their validation to be whole. I had built an island, a business, and a life. And for the first time, the air felt clear. I turned back to Julian, who took my hand and squeezed it. The music started again, a soft, triumphant cello melody that carried over the waves. My parents were gone, leaving behind only their pilled sweaters and their bitter pride. I was standing on my own soil, surrounded by people who saw me. The real me. That's the thing about family. Sometimes the people who raised you are the ones you have to outgrow to finally find yourself. What do you think of this ending? If you felt that sense of vindication, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't defined by their critics. Have you ever had a big reveal moment with toxic family members? Let us know your stories in the comments below. We read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe to Silent Revenge Lab for more stories of standing tall and speaking your truth.